Sir Nicholas, I'm just wondering if on a Mike D'Souza from CanWest News Service, on a business as usual scenario, I'm wondering if since your report came out and you've had a chance to see some of your conclusions debated, if you've revised any of your forecasts and what is your best guess right now for the future of the economy and the world if there is a business as usual scenario? Is it as high as 20%? What are the probabilities of the economy shrinking?
Yeah, we said somewhere between 5 and 20% on the basis of some specific assumptions that we provided. Since doing that, and the result of lots of debate, we've given some sensitivity analysis. What if you assume this about how the damages go up with temperature? What if you assume this about pure time discount rates? If you assume this about your attitudes to intergenerational equality or inequality? Because this is about what does this generation do for the other generations. So you can fiddle around with the structure of the system that your scientific and economic structure of the system that you're analyzing, and you can fiddle around with the values, because this is about ethics. After all, it's about the ethics of what this generation does relative to others. It's about the ethics of what rich countries do relative to poor countries, and so on. So you have to have your structure of the way the world works scientifically, the way that feeds into economic difficulties and damages, and you have to bring your ethical values to the debate. You can't have this debate without the ethical values, and it's dangerous and dishonest if you try to do so. So changing different assumptions in those areas I described, structure of models, values, we show that the kind of conclusions we came to of somewhere above 5% of GDP, averaged over time, averaged over possible outcomes, averaged over parts of the world, that's a pretty robust conclusion. But let me say, there are 3 ways you can get rid of this problem. I don't think any of them are acceptable. But the first way is to deny the science, that this is the biggest hoax that scientists have ever perpetrated on the human race. Well, if that's what you believe, then you wouldn't bother about climate change, though you might want to think about the risks that you might be wrong. But essentially, to deny the science, I think, is now absurd, given the weight of the scientific evidence, given the recent report. The second way you can get rid of all this is to say, well, human beings are fantastically adaptable. Whatever comes along, we'll deal with it. I think that's reckless. If you now see the kinds of risks that we run that I was describing of business as usual, moving into a next century where there's a higher than 50% chance of temperature increases above 5 degrees centigrade, that's an enormous change. Of course, much higher changes the further north that you go. That, in my view, is reckless. I mean, it's saying that you can adapt to risks of a kind that human beings have never really faced in the past. We don't know the detail of those risks, but we know from the discussions we're just having now that they would involve very big movements of population, for example, big parts of the world becoming uninhabitable. The third way you can get rid of all this is say, I don't care about the future. And that, I think, many of us would regard as unethical. It's couched sometimes and buried in economic discussions as high pure time discount rates. That's the jargon. But if you have a pure time discount rate, not a discount rate, a pure time discount rate, which is discrimination against the future just because it's in the future, you can get rid of this problem as well. 2% pure time discount rate tells you that somebody born 35 years before you has half the value. Right? Nothing to do with whether they're richer or not. They have half the value because of their later date of birth. The person who's born earlier, 35 years earlier, has twice the value. I don't think that's an ethical position which most people would want to take. I think if that's the way you're going to go, you should come out and do it in the open. So deny the science, and I think it's just absurd. Say we can adapt to anything, I think that's reckless. And say I don't care about the future, I think is unethical. But those are the routes that you can go. At the broad level, I just gave you the answer. If you do the detailed sensitivity analysis to different kinds of assumptions, the conclusion we came to is pretty robust.
Just assuming we reach that probability of the 5-degree increase, is that where we hit the 20%? cost to the economy, or?
Those are the 5 to 20% were averaged over time, and it depends on what you include. You know, how much do you include for your non-market ecological valuations, and what do you assume about the risks to the climate? So these higher values come from building stronger judgments about the risk of climate change into the model, and they come from taking distributional judgments, worrying more about the impacts in poor parts of the world and rich. So the two key things for that 20% were the more risky climate, building stronger climate risk into it, and taking stronger distributional value judgments about the ethics of damaging poor people relative to rich. That's what gives you the higher numbers.
Ehsan Massoud from Nature, you've been traveling the world, going to different countries, taking the message of the review to different capitals.
Carbon offsetting the travel, I hasten to add.
Is one of your expected outcomes from this exercise that other countries would also have similar reviews of the economics of climate change? And would you, for example, see that Canada should do something similar, or the United States?
I think much more detailed regional analyses of how you move to a low-carbon economy and what the costs and risks you run through climate change and what you have to adapt to. Those are very important, and a lot of countries are working on those issues. Personally, I'm hoping to spend a fair bit of time when I go back to London School of Economics working on South Asia, which is, you know, an area I happen to know pretty well, and where there are very many people at risk. But I think all countries should look very carefully at what's the best way for them of moving to a low-carbon economy. It'll depend on all sorts of things. It'll depend on their geography and their latitude. It'll depend on the structure of their economies. It will depend how their towns and rural areas function. So I think these particular studies are of great importance.
Just a quick follow-up. Is your review a one-off, or is it a work in progress? Will there be a review of the review maybe after a year?
There's no way in which one contribution is the last word, and there's no way that it was intended as the last word. It's a contribution to a discussion, and it's a contribution to a discussion in an area of work in economics which has been going for a while but is relatively new. So I would want to see it that way. I would see the kind of regional studies that you mentioned just now as one very important way forward in all this. I think it's very important to study techniques and possibilities of international collaboration. I think we have to understand in much greater detail the links between temperature and economic damages. I think there's a great deal further to do. But I would have thought that the basic conclusion that from the point of view of the economics of risk, the costs of action are a great deal less than the costs of inaction. I expect that to be a pretty robust conclusion.